what if we fix aging, right? And, what if all those numbers are off by a factor of 2? What if there's radical cultural change that causes people to have like much fewer children? There's just so many different curveballs that could happen. What if, we do discover evidence of alien life, like even if it is bacteria, right? And that just creates a big philosophical awakening in people. There's just so many of these big unknowns.
Hey, great to have you, Vitalik, for this conversation about the intersection of science and crypto called Decentralized Science, hosted at DeSci London at the Francis Crick Institute. Yeah, maybe we get directly into it. So on decentralized science, I would be curious how you define decentralized science and which aspects of it are you most excited about?
I guess I view decentralized science as a collection of ideas that basically have to do with trying to answer the question of what are some ways in which emerging open and decentralized technologies can make science better, can improve science, the institutions of science, in a broad sense, can improve how people who are doing science can collaborate with each other and get things out to the broader public. So I think some examples of this would include, one is just funding, right? So the interesting thing about I think cryptocurrency is that first of all, it's just a very effective fundraising tool by itself, right? Because I've used cryptocurrency to donate money to various kinds of charities, like some of them doing giving money directly to the poor, some of them doing existential risk research, some of them also doing longevity research or doing other kinds of science. I think my most recent really big and significant one was donating some amount of money to Impetus Grants, which is doing longevity. So just crypto as payments, I think, is one big part of it. And just in addition to providing more funding for science, I think it's fascinating in how it provides for more diverse funding, right? Like it's not just the traditional institutions, it's also a pretty wide array of individuals that can provide funding in a lot of cases. Then going a bit beyond that, there's things like DAOs and things like quadratic funding and all of these different tools that try to create a more crypto native and more structured approach to funding different kinds of science projects, right? So quadratic funding in general, it's this kind of decentralized and democratic way of choosing where the funds from a particular funding pool go. So one way to think about it is it's like a matching system, right? So if people donate to one project, then the matching pool also contributes its money. But the unique thing about quadratic funding is that the match is greater the larger the number of distinct people that contribute to a project, right? So if project A, let's say, gets $10,000 each from 2 people, but project B gets $1 each from 20,000 people, then project B is going to get a much higher match than project A does. And there's some really interesting mathematical reasoning for why quadratic funding is economically optimal in a certain sense. And if people want to read up on my explanation of that, I'm on my blog, vitalik.ca. I have, if you just Control F for quadratic, you can find my post on the quadratic mechanisms in general. And then I think we also want to kind of go a bit beyond quadratic funding by itself, right? Like there's the concept of DAOs in general, and there have been more and more DAOs. Like there's Vita DAO, there's other kinds of DAOs now that are trying to organize the process of deciding who to fund in all kinds of more structured ways, and even going beyond just the funding question. There's also potentially the concept of using blockchain traceability or NFTs or soul-bound tokens or anything like that to try to do a better job of just maintaining the graph of who contributed how much to what, right? Because one of the big issues in academia is the whole peer review system, and the way that by itself has basically turned into its own game that is unfair in a lot of ways and gets exploited in a lot of ways and exclusive in a lot of ways, and creates a very misaligned behavior as people try to chase citations in a lot of ways. And the question of like, can we both try to make better versions of what the peer review or what the citation graph tries to do, and what the peer review process tries to do, and also use blockchains and these tokens to really kind of weave that into the process of doing things and the process of funding things, and really make rewarding people for any contributions to the things that lead to important results downstream be something that happens much more seamlessly and much more automatically. Retroactive funding by optimism is one good example, right? So I think just zooming out of it, it's this large collection of things that people are doing with blockchains, with DAOs, with cryptocurrencies, and with soul-bound tokens, and with ZK and all of these different tools that try to like reform or replace or improve on all kinds of processes in like how we do science as a civilization.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think maybe we want to double click on public goods. So I think it's really interesting to see like the first experiments with quadratic funding, also showing some of course of like the ways that it could potentially be improved. So I would be curious on public goods experiments like quadratic funding and retroactive funding, which experiments would you like to see in the context of science that you haven't seen yet, or also potential improvements to quadratic funding or retroactive funding that we should attempt?
Yeah, I think science is actually a great place to try to do experiments and like more sophisticated forms of retroactive funding, because science is the one place where it's like more obvious than anywhere else. Like I think it's true everywhere, but it's particularly obvious in science, like just how complicated the contribution graph leading to any particular result is, right? Like if, let's say, someone invents some new zero-knowledge proof protocol, usually that protocol itself is a version of some other idea, and it uses some particular polynomial commitment scheme that was invented by someone 2 to 10 years ago, and then it builds on top of this other result, and that polynomial commitment scheme also builds on top of other results, and it's basically people building on stuff that's built on stuff that's built on stuff that goes all the way back to RSA and Shannon and other stuff in the 1940s to 1970s, and ultimately stuff even long before that, right? And there's more of a tradition within science of like being explicit about that graph, which I think is fascinating. And what that means is that it's an opportunity to try to solve what I think might be one of the critiques of retro funding in practice, which is basically that like the last step in a particular chain that leading to some outcome gets funded, but some of the less glamorous intermediate steps don't, right? And so everyone has a big incentive to try to like play up how big their contributions are and like be really loud about what they're doing. And that's like trying to reward not just people directly responsible, but also people who are responsible for kind of the parent and the grandparent of a particular result, and do that in a way that's incentive compatible. It's I think a really fascinating thing to think more about, and I think in the it's a good idea in every space, but in the decentralized science space in particular, it would be interesting to really try to start.
Which ideas from decentralized society, also called DSOC, that you coined with Glenn Whale and Pooja, and broadly in social technologies, are you most excited about in the context of science?
I think there is definitely a big overlap, right? Because DSOC is in a lot of ways all about like exploring the non-financial ways to try to encode different kinds of relationships. So, we have things like popes that encode, whether or not someone attended a particular event. We have, things like proof of humanity. We, have a bunch of various attestation protocols that people are working on. And I think all of those have a big place in DeSci, right? Because, like as I was mentioning before, one of the big things that I think the DeSci space could do is like really try to like do better things with having a higher quality kind of contribution graph, right? And that's something that we could get more of automatically just by having more of that kind of information to committed to in the chain everywhere, right? So the more of there are these public commitments of like what contributed to what, who participated in what, and who was a part of a particular community, the more it becomes possible to do more of those kinds of experiments, right? So I view DSOC as being a space that's going to create and really kind of build out a base layer that will make available information that a lot of these decentralized protocols are going to end up making use of.
On decentralized society, I wonder, do you see the first use case being mainly around identity and cell-bound tokens, and then enabling a bunch of other use cases? Like, what could some MVPs of this look like if like a builder is listening who wants to build something at the intersection of DSOC and DeSci? Like, for example, there's Gitcoin Passport, which I think is interesting, but there might be other identity solutions or other DSOC ideas that one could build.
I think the other really natural one is basically trying to like think through and figure out what it actually would mean in practice to have like some kind of pope that's like the proof of attendance token that represents contribution to some particular like piece of scientific research, right? Now, which like it could mean that like you get one by being an author of some paper or some post. It could mean being an like just being involved in a particular community or at a particular event that's doing research in a particular area. Like, I don't know yet, right? But that's one of the challenges that's worth figuring out.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier some of the amazing initiatives that you supported. Maybe could you paint a picture of kind of like the areas of science that you're most excited about and why you're excited about them?
Sure. So one that I've obviously been excited about for a long time is longevity research, right? Like, I read Aubrey's book, Ending Aging, when I was a teenager, and I was immediately convinced and definitely really inspired by the vision. And since then, that's always something that a space that I've dreamed that I could somehow be helpful to. And so I started donating to longevity pretty much as soon as I started having significant amounts of money. I tried to continue being more supportive of different groups in the space in various ways. In addition to longevity, one of the others that I've started going into recently is COVID research, right? This was actually one that kind of happened accidentally in that, I got these dog coins back in 2021, and I needed to send the dog coins somewhere, and right at that exact same time, India was getting hit really hard by the COVID situation, right? This was like late April, early May 2021. And there was this group called Crypto COVID Relief India that was just starting to help India try to make its way through the crisis. And I sent some dog coins to Crypto Relief. Like, these are the Shiba Inu tokens that I got that had just somehow ballooned to a really huge market cap. And at the time, I thought that it was not going to be a huge amount of money, and so I didn't really think much of it. But they ended up being able to get far more money out of it than I had imagined it would be possible, right? Like, I imagined they'd be able to get like maybe $10 or $20 million, and then Shiba would crash to zero. but they ended up cashing out like a bit over 400 million USDC. Then they started funding a lot of projects in India, and then I also started working on this effort called Balvi with some other people who were into infectious disease science and really understood the COVID situation that I knew. That would also simultaneously use some of that money for some more kind of potentially speculative and high risk, but also potentially really valuable projects, right? So this is basically like full spectrum COVID support. So it included projects that were working on masks, projects that were working on vaccines, UV irradiation, air filtering, wastewater surveillance, just like the entire spectrum of figuring out ways to detect COVID. Testing is the other one, both better like antigen tests and like lab tests and PCRs and everything in between. And then, finally try to deal with COVID and treat it and make it less of a problem in the event that someone does get it. And what was interesting was that, Balbi did end up funding a lot of different work. It even ended up funding a lot of open source work, right? So one of the things was RadVac, which was an open source project that was working on vaccines for COVID. And they were one of the early ones that started working on nasal vaccines, right? Because they, there's this fact about COVID that the place where it's like easiest and most practical to stop it actually is like basically in the upper respiratory system. If like you don't get that, then like basically you're not actually going to create a vaccine that completely stops COVID, because like you could easily get it and pass it on to someone, even if the rest of your body outside the respiratory system is immune, right? So if you want to make what's called a sterilizing vaccine, then like you have to get pretty close to the source. And also like nasal vaccines, they don't require an injection, potentially easier to administer, potentially like you could just give them out to people, less scary and all that. And they were one of the earliest projects that were doing that. There were a bunch of other projects as well, other vaccine projects, other projects in a whole bunch of other areas. So what was fascinating there, I think, was that one, just cryptocurrency ended up being an extremely convenient funding method, especially for all of these different international things, right? It's just so much easier than sending a bank wire, even with the, controls that we had. Like we had a multi-sig wallet and multiple people had to sign off to prevent the money from getting stolen, right? Like, which definitely adds like a bit of bureaucracy and checking, but like even with that, it's just so much easier than sending bank wires for everything and dealing with all kinds of banking systems, and it arrives instantly. Then the other one, I think, is just like the value of a model of philanthropy that's more willing to trust people, right? Like a lot of donors to these projects say try really hard to inject their own opinions into everything and basically say, hey, you have to put all your money into this and put all your money into that. And there's no way I'm going to let you spend anything on overhead, because everyone agrees that overhead is, totally unacceptable and bad. And, these things end up actually like hamstringing a lot of people, right? And with Balvi, we were trying to be lean, trying to intentionally not do that. And I think that led to a lot of good outcomes, right? And then I think it also counts as a science, even though it's not biology, but the whole zero knowledge space, right? I feel like I've been trying to support the zero knowledge space in multiple ways. So one of them is obviously, Ethereum Foundation funding a lot of zero knowledge research. I did actually contributed a bit myself to a couple of zero knowledge projects. A tiny feature credited to myself ended up like making its way into one of the original Plunk protocols, which I thought was kind of fun. But the other really big thing was just making these explainers, right? These blog posts that tried to make the math behind zero knowledge protocols and a whole bunch of other cryptography really accessible to people. And there, what I basically felt like I was doing was trying to fill what I thought was like this missing middle niche, where on the one hand, you have academic papers, which are just like horrible and unreadable. And like part of the reason why they're horrible and unreadable is not because, academics are like bad people who are elitist. There definitely is some elitism. It's just because, the incentive structure encourages writing to a particular audience, and I think changing the incentive structure is part of what a DSci is supposed to be about, right? So, either you have PDFs that are basically unreadable unless you're almost part of the same lab, and then on the other hand, you have pop sci writing, which is extremely accessible, but it just like doesn't explain, pretty much anything, right? It's like, trying to explain physics to people, and then, so there's this thing called a light cone, and you can imagine a light cone by imagining something like one of the pyramids of Egypt, except it's circular. And, it gives an image in people's head, but it doesn't actually help people, understand the science in the sense of, being able to, getting insights about how the world works that would, help them actually understand or predict anything. And I wanted to fill the big missing middle of writing that's both accessible to some number of people and yes, you'll have to know a bit of undergraduate math, and yes, you'll have to work hard, but at the same time, you can still understand it, but still actually being accurate and actually describing the whole protocol. And I think part of my vision there was definitely just inspired by my own experience as a self-taught person in a lot of areas, and just being frustrated by, all the unreadable PDF papers and the, extremely superficial pop sci material, and trying to create something better for people who are kind of not taking the conventional university path. And that's good, ended up getting a lot of good feedback around on a lot of those pieces, and it feels like that's turned into more of a trend with a lot more people writing that kind of stuff now, which I think is good, right? I think educating people, decentralized education about science really should be viewed as being part of decentralized science, right? Popularizing knowledge, and even popularizing knowledge across disciplines is so valuable, right? Because so many of the important contributions, I think, come from intersections of different disciplines. So those are, some of the things that I've done, and I, definitely look forward to doing more things in the future.
Amazing. Yeah, what strikes me as unique with your kind of efforts is just the variety of different approaches, even from the Ethereum Foundation to Balvi to some of those early academic efforts to much more non-traditional ones. What has been some surprising learnings between, for example, how something like Arc Institute even, or Empathis and Balvi is set up, and being kind of in the trenches with something like Balvi? I'd be super curious, which learnings you incorporated from, for example, Ethereum Foundation and other things into setting up Balvi, and how you structured, which might be different from a traditional foundation or grant-giving body.
Yeah, I think being lean is one of the learnings, right? So basically, another one is setting up an organization that is explicitly not trying to have an infinite lifespan. And I think to some extent those two are connected, right? In the sense that there was this, I think it was Venkatesh Rao, who was this one of the newfangled internet philosophers who has a lot of interesting ideas, but one of them is, I think he called it Neotonism. It's the opposite of the Lindy effect, where the Lindy effect is saying, I trust things more if they're old because they've stood the test of time. He's saying, I trust things more if they're new because they haven't been corrupted by the inevitable pressures of social entropy yet, right? And part of the reason why structures gain entropy over time is because they go through disasters, and those disasters lead to calls for defending against things and creating layers of accountability, and defending against more problems. And over time, that just leads to structures that have good defenses against leading to problems, but also, unfortunately, good defenses against being able to move quickly and do new things as well. And the the thing that the Ethereum Foundation and Balvi have in common is that they're explicitly not entities that are meant to survive forever. And I think with the Ethereum Foundation, it's like more open-ended, right? But there's definitely a big strand to the original vision that says that, like, well, maybe the thing's going to disappear eventually, or maybe the thing's going to turn into a DAO eventually. And Balvi is explicitly intended to start with a pool of money, spend it, and then say that we're done, right? So, like, explicitly say that the goal is to disappear so as to not have the pressures that lead to creating some of these permanent bureaucracies and avoid the pressures of kind of people, more and more people trying to exploit it over time. So that kind of approach, I think, has been fascinating to see. Another one is just appealing internationally, right? So one of the big differences between crypto and a lot of other frontier tech industries is that, like, if you look at AI, for example, AI is completely based in the Bay Area. Like, OpenAI, Bay Area, Stable Diffusion, Bay Area, DeepMind, and like the entire kind of Google Alphabet bubble, largely Bay Area, right? Meta, it's in there. It's like huge Bay Area dominance. Crypto is not like that at all, right? Like the Ethereum Foundation is legally based in Switzerland with a major satellite in Singapore. It has a large number of developers in Berlin. It has people in the US, and even within the US, actually, Ethereum's primary American hub is Denver, which is, it's like, neither SF in New York nor one of the kind of mainstream contrarian hubs like Austin or Miami. It's like, hey, Denver. And it's like, right in the middle, and it's there and it's cool. The Zcash is also there, by the way. Well, technically, the Ethereum Foundation is more in Boulder and Zcash is more in Denver. But, like, to me as an airplane person, if it shares an airport, it's part of the same city. But Canada, we have developers in Taiwan, we have developers in all kinds of European countries. Justin has been creating more and more of like a research bubble in the UK and places like Cambridge. Strong community in Taiwan all the way through. More and more of a Chinese community growing, right? And more of a Latin American community growing. And a lot of Ethereum people in places like Argentina. So crypto has been, I think, just practically very more successful than most tech industries at international diversity in that way. And I think like Balvi in particular also had that always as part of its vision, right? I mean, both Balvi had Crypto Relief, right? And that Crypto Relief was about supporting, India. And this was happening at a time when I remember one of my kind of bigger disappointments, right? Like the whole India crypto situation was just bubbling up on Twitter. And I remember, like, even in the US, like almost nobody was talking about it except for basically a couple of Silicon Valley people, right? And this was actually one of the things that I still respect Silicon Valley for. Like I thought the Silicon Valley elites were like more on the ball and like recognizing that there is a problem happening in India and trying to think through like what they could do to help than like pretty much anyone inside the Biden administration. And it was only when the Twitter noise became really just like unbearably loud that they came out and made one kind of a statement, right? So that was I thought a kind of testament to like more non-political organizations' greater ability to care about things that go beyond the kinds of countries that you and me and probably even most people listening to this are going to be based in. But then Balvi itself, went all the way beyond India and supported, stuff in Thailand, stuff in the US, stuff in the UK, a lot of stuff in Latin America, stuff in China, stuff in all kinds of countries. And I thought that was, it was good that we did that. And it was only possible, I think, because of the international networks that we leveraged and international networks that were actually only available to me because I had made that decision, 9.5 years ago to start roaming around and be a crypto nomad instead of being based somewhere. So yeah, being international, I think, is really key. Just being willing to trust people and processing grants quickly. That was something that the EF definitely has done it various times. It sometimes has done sometimes it takes longer. It's I think, obviously not always the right approach for the long term, especially because if you do it too much, then eventually the grifters kind of catch up, and that's probably one of the main reasons to eventually become more careful. But like, when your goal is scaling up quickly and when your goal is helping a lot of people quickly, and especially when you start off being kind of not an established donor in a space, it can be a good approach. So yeah, those are some examples, and I'm hoping that those aren't just the models that we're going to be stuck with. I hope that like things like DeSci and reputation systems and popes and all of these things are going to do an even better job at helping to solve the problem of for example, like who is trustworthy and what kind of people are worthy of more of a fast-tracked process, right? And trying to really get closer to the Pareto frontier between accountability where it's necessary and giving people the freedom to do their job in places where that's obviously the right approach.
Yeah, totally agreed. It's kind of crazy that how much of the science and everything else is centering around, for example, SF or Boston, and how many cities and places it's kind of leaving out, kind of shifting gears towards scientific progress. I would be curious on your takes on what is broadly holding back progress, maybe in a scientific and technological sense globally, but also kind of related to that, which scientific breakthroughs you're most excited about to see in your lifetime. And hopefully your lifetime is fairly long, but that might be one, of course, breakthrough that might extend the amount of breakthroughs you see in your lifetime. But would be super curious, especially also under this lens of Tyler Cohen and Peter Thiel and others and Patrick Collison saying we're in a stagnation and that we need to get back onto the track of growth and scientific progress. Be curious on your take.
Yeah, I think there is a bunch of factors. Probably the biggest is always just the fact that public goods are chronically underfunded because it's hard to create a business model for them, right? If you're just a small actor and at a global scale everyone is a small actor, then you only get at most a few percent of the benefit, maybe even a fraction or percentage point of the benefit of anything that you fund, right? And that is just always the biggest problem. And that's a problem that humanity's been stuck with, and it's a problem that is going to be hard to get past. But if we can get from funding things that only funding things that have a 10,000 to 1 benefit cost ratio, and then all the way down to funding everything that has more than, let's say, 100 to 1 benefit to cost ratio, that's already a huge amount of progress. Other things, I think, definitely exclusiveness and silos, right? The fact that there's a lot of knowledge that's sort of generated by particular academic communities, and it's stuck in particular academic communities, and very smart people who would be able to contribute just don't have that knowledge be accessible to them, because we've invented a path that basically says that you only get the required background knowledge by age 24, only if you're wealthy and privileged enough to go through a particular university path. And the reality is, if you enable people, there's lots of people who make huge contributions when they're 15, right? So trying to create paths that are accessible to more people and, across wealth levels, across age levels, across, kind of regional and national levels, I think is something that's going to be really valuable. Ideology is also, I think, another one, right? There's the whole line, and I think Tyler Cohen is one of the people who has kind of, reblogged things about this, that basically sometime after, World War II, and then kind of going further over time, a lot of people became much more conservative in certain ways about the physical world, and there was this mentality that, actually kind of keeping the world pristine is good, and large-scale intentional human change is by default a bad thing. and the physical world is something that we should not touch, and that look, we see that in a lot of different contexts. So like that probably massively reduced the amount of research into nuclear power, for example. It's is similar things are definitely reducing the level of interest into longevity research. Similar things are reducing the level of interest into just all kinds of areas that where improving human lives ultimately involves changing either ourselves or the physical world. But the big irony is that the digital world ended up being completely exempt from that mentality. And so we basically had a couple of decades where a lot of the smartest people basically went into creating social networks, creating all kinds of these like internet-y tools for and creating all kinds of just ways for people to play, in some cases increasingly negative, of some internet games with each other. And lately we've been seeing a backlash against that, which is interesting, right? Like we've been seeing a lot more interest in solar power, a lot more interest in nuclear power, a lot more interest in nuclear fusion, a lot more of just kind of like human positivity, and even positivity about large-scale human intentional action. Right, this is one of the ideas that I feel like Palladium does a good job of promoting, for example. Also, the rise of the developing world, right? Because the developing world, I think, that never really went through the same phase of like getting a little disillusioned with everything that the rich country West did, and been seeing like a lot of Indians, for example, getting into science with some very different perspectives. So, and also like the crypto space by itself, right? Like one way that I think you can critique the crypto space, and you can say, look, oh, actually it's just part of the exact same phenomenon of people in the 2000s and in the 2010s, like just forgetting about the physical world and thinking that they can do everything they want by just creating new tools for people to interact with each other digitally. And I think one of the interesting things about network states, for example, is that like that is an instance of people with a in a lot of cases definitely kind of like crypto ideological lineage, but like rediscovering the fact that the physical world is important. And aside from network states, I mean, probably another example is like the radical exchange movement, which has definitely a different ideological bent, but I think it's also about physical spaces to some extent in the same way. And there's a lot of crypto adoption going, or like crypto-inspired people going in that direction too, right? So I think, just having an ideology that's, positive about the collective human ability to improve our understanding about the world, and even have an impact on the world and on physical space, and an understanding of what it means to do the right thing and not do the wrong thing in those areas, without just like falling back on saying like let's not go here entirely, is one of the things that I think is like changing and slowly coming back, and I think is going to also bring more people into science in the future.
I'd be curious on kind of like this century broadly, like people like Holden Karnofsky called it potentially the most important century for many reasons, including of course like the existential risks and AI progress and broader technological and scientific progress. What's your view on kind of like how you could imagine this century to play out, especially in regards to, for example, AI progress, the singularity, or specific existential risks from AI to others? What are kind of like top of mind for you for this century?
It's a good question.
It's kind of like a vision or forecast.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that there's a lot of curveballs this century, right? So, like, I mean, 2020 to 2022 have been this like crazy long 3-year period of curveballs. I mean, a lot of negative curveballs, and some curveballs that are either positive or negative depending on your views on AI risk. but definitely lots of curveballs either way. And over the next century, there's just all these different potential curveballs where we just don't know yet, right? So one of them is what the AI future is going to look like. Like basically, are we in more of an Elisa Yudkowsky kind of FOOM world where it's just inevitable that some AI project, once it gets powerful enough, is just going to self-improve until it can basically control the world, and it's up to us to make sure that it controls the world in a way that's agreeable to us, despite us being very, very far away from being good at at being able to put concrete goals of any kind into AIs at this point? Or are we in more of a Robin Hanson world where there's no single AI that's particularly far ahead of all the other AIs, and so we're going to see a politically multipolar world going into the foreseeable future, and then there isn't really an existential risk, but there is just this ongoing battle of offense versus defense technology, and our job is to try to make sure that offense doesn't overtake defense by too much. Or also, are we in a world where the current LLM approach is basically that plus scale literally is all we need? Or are we in a world where we're already starting what GPT-4 is going to be close to the last major piece of progress that we get from LLMs, and otherwise LLMs are exhausted and we need some really significant more innovations. Another curveball is geopolitics, right? So obviously last year has seen a really unfortunate negative curveball in relations between Europe and Russia, and the next 2 decades are we could easily see a very negative curveball in relations between the US and China. We could see a very negative curveball in relations between India and China, or nuclear proliferation, right? That's another one. This is something no one's expecting, but what if just any one of these countries that has a big grudge against the United States just decides to go and sell nukes with full plans for how to build more of them for $10 million a pop to a bunch of randos, and we're up to having 30 nuclear states within 2 decades, and some of them start declaring a nuclear war against each other. Bio is another curveball, right? So we have one big COVID, which I guess right now the smart people are still confused and it's still 50-50 about whether it was a wet market or a lab leak. And but lab leaks do happen all the time, and it's we could see more of them as we see more labs, and we could see more intentional ones at some point, right? There's just but then on the other hand, what if it turns out that longevity does get solved literally 20 years from now, and what's that going to do on what's that going to do to Peter Zeihan's demographic projections, right? It's everyone has these numbers that say in 2100 India is going to have a population of 1.4 billion, China's going to be 0.7 billion, US is going to be 0.45 billion, Africa is going to be somewhere around 4. But what if we fix aging, right? And what if all those numbers are off by a factor of 2? What if there's radical cultural change that causes people to have much fewer children? What if there's the combination of having a richer society and having one tier more of automation suddenly makes it more practical for every family to have 5 kids each? There's just so many different curveballs that could happen. What if we do discover evidence of alien life, even if it is bacteria, right? And that just creates a big philosophical awakening in people. There's just so many of these big unknowns, and a lot of the ones that I've mentioned are negative, but I think we could easily see a lot of positive unknowns as well. It's definitely going to be a really big century, and it's definitely going to be a really important one. I think obviously the 21st century is more important than any century that came before, but the question is is the 22nd century going to be even more important, right? Is this the final boss of humanity, or are we really at step n-2? Or do we really have the model wrong and we're going to see extremely radical change that looks very radical even from the inside continue going forward for millennia? I don't know yet.
Maybe to close off to kind of like also the audience of builders in decentralized science, you mentioned some of the ideas you would be excited about. What are maybe some other ideas you haven't mentioned yet that also for like the DeSci London Hackathon you would be excited for people to see build?
Makes it excited to see build. Yeah, I think one would definitely be some kind of like, whether it's attestation-based or soulbound token-based or poke-based or something, way, some kind of solution for trying to like assign credit recursively for things. Possibly an implementation of retroactive public goods funding that tries to incorporate those kinds of ideas. Possibly, what else? Something on the education side would be interesting, right? So like trying to, whether proactively or retroactively, public fund education in different kinds of scientific disciplines, and different ways of trying to evaluate like which ones of those are actually effective. Prediction markets, actually, this is one we didn't talk about at all, right? But this is, I know Robin Hanson is like really into this, and this is like one of his big primary ideas. But it's like there's just such a natural tie-in, I think, between decentralized science and prediction markets, right? And basically using them as a way of like trying to predict what paths in scientific research are more likely to be valuable. And retroactive public goods funding, to some extent, like it'd be like saying that kind of implies prediction markets, right? Because the whole idea is that, you're going to have investors that try to like participate in these retroactive rewards, and that's how the stuff gets funded. But like prediction markets more generally and their applications to science is another interesting area. And, with layer 2s and polymarket, I think, prediction markets are getting more and more viable and more adoption. So expanding them would definitely be really interesting. So yeah, those are, a few examples, but otherwise I'm sure people can come up with a lot of their own too.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll collect all the also show notes and things like the DSOC paper and other things we discussed. Maybe it's like the very last one. Is there a specific like book, blog post or like podcast you would recommend people specifically in the context of science that you enjoyed recently?
So, it's a good question. 80,000 hours is always good. I feel like there's a lot of just very interesting and very smart people in talking about all of the different areas that that we brought up today. I don't know. I feel like it would be interesting to just like have a podcast focusing on decentralized science, particularly at this point. Like, does something like that exist yet? Maybe you should start one.
We like this actually will go up also on the DeSci podcast. So we also had like a long conversation with a bunch of different people. I'll share the link in the show notes, but we have a bunch of other also conversations coming up, and all the talks and workshops from DeSci conferences are already up. So finding the comments. And for example, Pooja's talk I really enjoyed on the intersection of DeSci and DSOC. So I think that's a good related one. But thank you so much, Vitalik, for taking the time, and wish you a great day. It was great to chat.
Thank you too. Have a good day too, and such.